In the meantime, the question of how these primary systems work at all or should work at all has come up now again and again as both Democrats and Republicans have been challenging this crazy primary and caucus system that we have in this country. Can that system be reformed? Should it be reformed? Here to talk about this and explain it all to me and explain a lot of stuff that I don't necessarily understand about this is John Opdycke. He's president of Open Primaries.org, a group supporting what they describe as the, quote, simple yet radical idea that no American should be required to join a political party to exercise their right to vote. Prior to becoming president of Open Primaries.org, John served as director of development of IndependentVoting.org, a think tank and strategy center for the independent political movement focused on legal, legislative, and grassroots efforts to enact and protect open and nonpartisan primaries. John Opdycke, welcome to the BradCast, sir.
Thank you, Brad. I'm really glad to be here.
Glad to have you. Now, listen, I'll disclose this right away. I'm kind of agnostic on this issue. So I'm open to your arguments, but I'm kind of agnostic in that I support the small d democratic notion that folks really should be able to determine how they'd like to fight and run for what they believe in. So if they want to, gather together and organize as a party, I kind of support that, even as I believe that the more involved the people are in the electoral process in general, the better. So I'm open to your arguments here in favor of open primaries. But before we get to that argument, before I let you try to convince me, why does a state like New York have closed primaries in the first place? In other words, what is the ostensible reason that they say they have them? And then we can talk about the real reason that they have them.
Well, the arguments are pretty straightforward. The political parties are private associations, and as such, they have the right, and this right has been given them by the Supreme Court, to determine the rules of their nominating processes. And that involves primaries, that involves conventions and delegates and so forth and so on. The problem is that the parties and the legislators that they elect that pass the laws that create the system, they want to have their cake and they want to eat it too. They both invoke First Amendment, private association, freedom of association rights, and at the same time they demand that the taxpayers fund these activities. And that is a fundamental conflict of interest. And to your question, of course Americans should have the right to form political parties. They should have the right to form all kinds of political associations, groups, organizations as they see fit. No one is challenging that right. That's a core value in America. But the question is, and this is a very serious question, is who does the political process belong to? Does the process itself belong to the people, or does it belong to the political parties? And right now, our democracy belongs lock, stock, and barrel to the political parties from top to bottom. And that is a very big problem, and it's beginning to come to light. And people are beginning to engage that issue, which I think is a very positive development.
So you cite the fact that they're using public resources to hold these elections, and that's different, I suppose, than a caucus system where the parties themselves run it. But in New York, you've got state resources, the election, the state election commission, the city election commissions, and so forth. They're running the primary on behalf of the parties, who then lock out voters. So your argument here, it sounds like, is that, hey, if we're going to use public taxpayer resources for these elections, everyone ought to be able to participate in it. Is that correct?
Yes, that's one argument. And also, I think that primaries, it's important to remember the history of primaries. Primaries were enacted during the Progressive era as a reform, as a way to bring the people into the back rooms where, in the smoke-filled rooms where party bosses were making decisions without any input from the voters. The voters were brought in only at the last minute to vote. So I'm not advocating getting rid of primaries. What I'm advocating for, what the Open Primaries movement is pushing for, is public primaries, not partisan primaries. And this is the system we now have in California, we have in Nebraska, we have in Washington, where instead of a Democratic primary and a Republican primary, you have a public primary. All the candidates seeking office appear on the primary ballot.
Mm-hmm.
All the voters, whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, a Green, a Libertarian, a Peace and Freedom, Independent, whatever, get the same primary ballot and get to choose from among all the candidates. And then the top two vote getters, regardless of party, they go on to the general election. This is a fundamentally different conception of what a primary is. It's a public primary, not a partisan primary.
And I want to talk very specifically about that top two primary. We call it out here the Cajun primary or jungle primary, it's called in some places, and concerns about that specifically. But before we get to that as a solution, why do you argue, and thank you for noting that a lot of people don't realize, the primary system itself is more democratic, again, small d democratic, than what we used to see when this was all decided amongst party insiders only in those, smoke-filled back rooms. So the primary system was meant to bring more people into it, but as you might argue, John Opdycke, not enough people, at least the way it's carried out now. But what do you regard as the real reason that parties in, for example, in New York, the political parties there, and even out here in California in the presidential primaries, the Republican presidential primary out here in California is completely closed. Democratic is a little less closed. But why do these political parties want to keep them closed? What are they concerned? Is it a concern about people gaming the primaries, people coming from other parties to game the system, essentially?
That's what they say. I think that's a red herring. It's a phony argument. I think that the parties are self-interested organizations, and I don't begrudge them this. I think that they're acting in ways that benefit themselves. And ask any politician, ask any party leader, and they will tell you in a moment of honesty that the best elections are the most predictable ones. Mm-hmm. And the way that you create predictable elections is by having maximal control over who gets to participate in that. So if you eliminate a group of voters that are more volatile, that are not part of the party structure, that are outside of that, you're controlling for a key factor. And, I think when it comes to getting members of their party elected, it just makes good business sense for the parties to have closed primaries. It's a way they can keep maximal control over the people they elect and to prevent unusual outcomes.
Which is an argument that I've sort of been trying to make when people ask about this, and frankly, when they complain about it, and I say, look, the parties can do whatever the parties want in that they are private organizations. They can, they can decide the rules for their primary contests, how the delegates are chosen and everything else. And people are, think it's undemocratic. Well, it is. Because, as you know, John, those are, they're private parties. They can do what they want. And if you don't like it, you can either form your own party or, somehow gather an effort to take on these parties. If they did not use public resources to hold these public primaries, actually these closed primaries, would you have any problem with that system if it was, run the way they run caucuses, where the parties paid for the cost of the primary vote?
Well, again, I don't think caucuses are the answer. I think that primaries are now part of the American political culture, and I think we should keep them. But I think that I agree with you in that I'm not here to reform the political parties. The parties are private organizations. Mm-hmm. They should do business the way they want to do business. And as you're saying, Americans are free to form other political associations or not associate at all. I mean, independent voters are now the largest and fastest growing segment of the electorate. The big issue is that the political parties are not just private organizations. They control the political process. They control the boards of elections. They control how redistricting is done. They control the primaries. They control voter registration. They control every aspect. They even control the presidential debates. And we Americans, we've participated in that. Mm-hmm. We have, in some ways, ceded some of our power to these political organizations. Mm-hmm. And I think that the time has come that we take that back. Not abolish political parties,
right,
but simply return them to an appropriate place. I honestly believe the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, what have you, their appropriate place in American politics should be similar to the NRA, the League of Women Voters, Planned Parenthood, Emily's List, groups on the left and right and center that advocate, that raise money, that push agendas. That's all very appropriate activity. But imagine if the NRA was responsible for conducting elections in this country. There would be an outcry. But the Democratic and Republican parties are no different.
Well,
in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, let me put it. Of course, some people would argue that the NRA does control elections in this country. But setting that aside for the moment, let's look at New York, where so who determines in New York whether there will be an open or closed primary? Is that the parties themselves, or is that a statutory in the state? How is that determination made? Do you know in New York?
It's made by the state legislature.
Okay, and the state legislature is, a body that can be voted in or out by the electorate. In other words, if the state legislature has decided that, yes, it will be closed primaries, isn't that something that the voters of New York have ostensibly agreed with because they keep electing these same legislators who, have passed the statute in the first place?
Well, on paper, yes. But the reality is that our state legislature is Democratic in name only. Its elected members all were elected in closed primaries. Mm-hmm. 90% of the members of the New York State legislature do not face competitive elections in November. 90%. The only competitive races they have are primaries. Okay?
Right.
There is absolutely no incentive among members of the legislature to open up the system. They benefit from a closed system. So the voters have very little opportunity to impact on that. Now, we have one member of the Assembly, Fred Thiel, who's the only independent in the entire legislature. He represents the eastern tip of Long Island, and he's introduced two important bills. One would open up the presidential primaries so independent voters can participate in them. The second one would apply to all federal and state primaries, and it would move New York to a nonpartisan public primary, as we have in Nebraska and California and Washington. Mm-hmm. And both those bills are now in the Assembly, and we're in the process of building a coalition and a movement to see if we can get some traction on them. But the New York State legislature is completely locked down and controlled by party insiders. So the notion that this is a body that's reflective of the people of New York, I think, is naive.
And as you, I'm sure, understand, John, I'm sort of largely playing the devil's advocate here as I'm trying to figure this out. But could the voters of New York not vote those people out? You say that it's, controlled by party insiders. I guess your suggestion is that even in November, in the general elections, that the choice is between two options in this case, the Republican insider and the Democratic Party insider, both of whom kind of like this two-party duopoly. They like this closed primary system, so there really is no third or fourth or fifth option for voters to change the system.
It's even worse than that. It's the Democrats and Republicans have carved up the state. Mm-hmm. So in 90% of the districts, if you live in New York City, for example, your choice in November is between a Democrat and nobody, or a 22-year-old Republican who's running to get some experience that is hoping to get 10 or 12% of the vote.
Because in that case, the Republicans don't put in a legitimate candidate because they think there's no way we're going to win this because it's so gerrymandered. Exactly. Don't waste resources.
Exactly. There's very few districts where where the general election is contested. It's about 10% of the districts in the whole state. So voters, the only opportunity they have to weigh in on the actual representatives is in the primaries. Those primaries are closed. So in California, where you have a public primary, you have a completely different dynamic. Most elections in November are competitive. Oftentimes you see two Democrats or two Republicans facing off against each other. You end this kind of process of making all the decisions in the first round, and then the November election being a rubber stamp, where all the voters get a chance to do is kind of rubber stamp what's been decided by party insiders in the primary. And that's a very big development, and it's had a major, major impact on the California political culture.
It has, and I should say I'm out here in California, and I've seen this over the past few election cycles since we've gone to this top two primary system, and I got to say, I'm not so sure I like it. Now, so I'm open to your arguments here as well. We did a series of stories back in 2012 at BradBlog.com. Our legal analyst, Ernie Canning, did a series of stories about how that top two primary system that we now have in California, how that kind of cuts both ways as far as against both Democrats and Republicans. And let me give an example or two and get your response. And let me also be clear, we're talking about all of the non-presidential primaries out here in California. The presidential primaries are still basically closed systems for each party. But other than that, U.S. Senate, U.S. House, et cetera, everybody sort of runs together, and whoever gets the top two vote getters go on to compete in November. Okay, but we had a distinct possibility back in 2012 that the voters of the great state of California would end up having a choice only between Democratic candidate Senator Dianne Feinstein and an Occupy Wall Street connected computer scientist guy by the name of David Levitt, who is also a Democrat. Now, I don't believe he ended up winning. I believe she actually faced a Republican, but we could have had a situation where you've got a state the size of California, the most populous in the country, where the voters are only allowed to choose between two Democrats. We have another case where you've got, I think this was a very Republican district, where you had, something like 14 different Republicans all running, competing against something like 6 Democrats. Well, there was no way that, that vote was going to be split up between those 14 Republicans. So there are concerns about the top two system as well, that is also not small d democratic and cuts out a lot of voters. Your response to that, John Opdycke?
I find it disingenuous, and it frankly doesn't make much sense to me. I don't understand how, though, literally the examples you gave are cutting out voters. In my opinion, what they're doing is they're empowering the voters. They're putting the voters in the position, not the parties, to determine who's going to make it to the final round. And no party is guaranteed any kind of special treatment. So if the voters of a district want to create a general election, this happened in Oakland, for example, a very, very liberal district. The two finalists were the incumbent Democrat, Pete Stark, a congressman who'd been there for 40 years, and an upstart Democrat, a guy named Eric Swalwell. Rather than have a token Republican against a Democratic incumbent, they wanted to pit two Democrats against each other. And they had a very, very spirited campaign, and ultimately Eric Swalwell was able to win that election. To me, that's an example of voter empowerment. The parties have to sweat it. The politicians have to sweat it. They're no longer guaranteed safe districts. There are no more safe districts in California. That very concept doesn't exist anymore. And I think that when people grumble about that, and they say, in this scenario with 14 Republicans and 6 Democrats, I love the fact that it's messy and difficult for the parties to figure out. It should be. It should be about what the voters want, not what makes life easy for the parties and for the party insiders.
So even if you have a district which is, let's say, very, very Republican-leaning, and therefore you've got tons and tons of Republican candidates who are running against just one Democrat, that one Democrat is probably going to get in a case like that. No, because they're the only Democrat to choose from, whereas all of the Republican vote is split up amongst them, even in a strongly Republican district.
Again, I find even the language of the votes being split up.
Mm-hmm.
Votes aren't split up. People vote.
Mm-hmm.
People go to the polls and they vote. And they vote for a lot of different reasons, and there's a lot of different scenarios. This system, in my opinion, creates much more healthy dynamic and gives the voters much more control. And I'll say this, the people that get elected in this system, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Greens, whatever, the people that get elected, they go to Sacramento representing their constituents, all of them. They're able to go to Sacramento and talk to legislators from other parties. Mm-hmm. They're able to enter into coalitions and conversations with people they disagree with. That is what is so lacking in so many states, and certainly in our Congress. Democrats and Republicans can't talk to one another. They can't do business together. And part of what's happening in California and in Nebraska and in Washington is that legislators, be they very conservative or very liberal, they're incentivized to focus on representing their constituents as opposed to playing party politics, which is all about gamesmanship and advancing the party agenda.
And your suggestion is if all of the candidates have to compete against each other in a single primary, that they are more likely to not go after each other, not attack, find coalitions within those groups?
It's not a suggestion. It's a fact. That's okay. What happens in a legislature that's elected in a nonpartisan way. You know, I could send you stories about how Nebraska works, where you have Democrats and Republicans introducing legislation together. You have all kinds of new coalitions that break out of political correctness and partisan confines.
Well, that's going beyond the primaries, John. I mean, we've talked about the Nebraska legislature. We've had some of those legislators on this show, but that's beyond the primaries. That's a system where at the state government level they say, hey, we're not going to separate. We're not splitting up, seating people by party. That's even bigger than what I thought we were talking about, which is opening up the primary system.
It's an extension of it.
Yeah.
Yes, no, they use the nonpartisan primary system to elect people, mm-hmm. and then when they go to the state house, they serve in a unicameral nonpartisan legislature. So it's an extension of the nonpartisan electoral system. It's a very positive one. I agree.
You've got a tough fight ahead of you to convince the country of all of this, but I think you make an excellent case. John Opdycke, people can go to openprimaries.org to get more information. They can and should follow you guys on the Twitters. I think you are Open Primary USA on Twitter. Is that correct, John?
Yes, that's right. Can I just add one more thing, Brad?
You bet.
One of the exciting things about the open primaries issue is that a number of important progressive leaders, including Bernie Sanders, including Robert Reich, have come out very strongly in favor of reforming the primary system. And I think that is a very important breakthrough because, and I say this as a progressive, the progressive movement has, in my opinion, been overly focused on political reforms that are essentially regulatory in nature, that deal with some of the abuses and voter suppression and ways in which the system is antiquated and unfair, but that doesn't really touch the party control of the system. And open primaries, you can't open the primaries without touching the party control of the system. And I would encourage all of your listeners, and I would encourage Mr. Sanders and Mr. Reich and other progressive leaders to stay committed to this issue. Bernie obviously is involved in a very heated election race. But this issue, this democracy issue, is something that the progressive movement, I believe, needs to pay a lot more attention to going into 2017.
John Opdycke, president of OpenPrimaries.org, supporting the, quote, simple yet radical idea no American should be required to join a political party to exercise their right to vote. Simple and, yes, radical indeed. John Opdycke, great talking to you about this. I hope to do it more in the future, and good luck with your campaign here. I think it's a very important one. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Brad.